In this episode, we discuss the 2024 documentary American Godfathers, The Five Families, and consider the vast influence the Mafia had on the 20th century in the United States. Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and joining me today is a man whose sharp takes can really hit like poisonous darts. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, you ready to show us why you're the Iron Man of the podcast game?
Yeah, man, I wasn't ready for that one. I was thinking about the poison dart frogs in the Amazon. So then you screwed me up with the Avengers thing. So
go in a few different directions.
Yeah, sorry.
Now, before we get started, I asked if you enjoy the show, hit subscribe and like the show on YouTube or your podcast app. Doing so really helps the show out. And we're recording on May 26, 2026. And Tunde, you and I recently checked out the 2024 documentary American Godfathers, The Five Families, which is actually based on the book, Five Families, The Rise, Decline, and Resurgence of America's Most Powerful Mafia Empires by Selwyn Raab. And the documentary, though, is currently airing on Netflix. And it did a good job of taking us from the origins of the culture behind the Mafia in Sicily to its rise in America in the early 1900s, and also how it developed and evolved and then ultimately fell over the course of the 20th century. So Tunde, just to get us started here, what stood out to you? Let's look at the origins part, like kind of at the beginning. What stood out to you about the origins of the Mafia in the U.S.?
Man, I found it very interesting, actually, because first what stood out to me was the history of Sicily.
Yeah.
I found that very interesting. I was ignorant to that history. And it's again,
the cultural factors that
and also just the history of kind of the Italian peninsula, the city state. I kind of knew about all that. But I didn't know that Sicily was like the last holdout. It makes sense. It's an island, the last to be conquered by Italy. And so I think it was 1860 when Italy, the nation, finally wrestled control of Sicily, the island, and brought it into its I guess under its umbrella as an actual part of the country. But there was a fierce independent spirit within the Sicilian population. So that's what I mean. It's an interesting reminder me a little bit of our founding fathers and the American story of this kind of this idea of rebellion and that they wanted to throw off the yoke of this, what they saw as an oppressor, the Italian state coming in. And then the fact
dated back though, because remember they were controlled by the Spanish at one point.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Greeks, the Phoenician. Yeah. There had been foreign control at various points over a long period of time.
Correct. And I guess maybe that's a better way to put it. The fact that they were this island in the Mediterranean that was kind of in between a lot of other stuff, right? It's like along the way to Rome, along the way to Egypt, along the way to all these places, you're probably stopping in Sicily and it's very valuable land. And then part of what came when the Italians came was the idea of a black market, right? One way to subvert the authority is to do things in the shadows. And so, that kind of origin, I felt was very interesting to me.
Yeah. I'd say, the origin piece was very interesting in the sense that, one of the things that stood out to me was the idea of absentee control of Sicily. And so, like this kind of like what you're talking about, like you had these foreign powers coming in, and for a while it was Spain, later it was Italy. And so you had these people who were in charge, so to speak, but they were never around. And so people got used to relying on and doing things for themselves, and authorities from the outside coming in were seen as not helpful. Don't deal with them. Don't say anything to them. Like they're not here to help. They're only here to take away and exploit. And so if you transplant that kind of cultural, muscle memory, so to speak, but just that kind of cultural into a urban environment like New York City, it's like you can see how that creates contrast that can form, or that creates pressures that can form something a little different, than what existed in New York City, but also something that drew upon kind of those values. And so people they have this mass immigration coming from Europe, and I think it was 4 million from Italy, and a lot of those were from Sicily, in the U.S. in a short period of time. Interestingly enough, they're escaping war and oppression and all that stuff in Europe. which, kind of rhymes with what we hear about now with immigrants coming from South America, Central America to the United States, or wanting to come here, trying to escape war, trying to escape oppression, economic conditions, and then coming to America for opportunity, which is the same stuff that a lot of these European immigrants were coming for in the early 1900s, late 1800s. So, but yeah, I think that the transplant of what was the way things were there and the values that people developed. Because, one of the things I said in the documentary was like, the grandma and the gangster had the same worldview. It's like, okay, got it. That's pretty serious, but you transplant those values and then stick them in, this hustling, bustling city full of all these other ethnic groups, and everybody's kind of, like there's authorities, but they can't really control everything because there's millions and millions and millions of people, so it set the stage to really understand how a lot of the values of the mafia that it was built on, the pillars that they were built on, how those kind of evolved.
Yeah, I mean, it's such great history too, because as you talk about the transition, like you're saying, to kind of how these Italians, especially from Sicily, came to the United States in the early 20th century. Like you said, it's amazing how many parallels there are to today, and with how they were treated as immigrants in comparison to how some other groups are treated today. Like you said, the motivations to why people mass migrate, just in general throughout human history. It's usually people don't just get up and leave where they're born and raised and where their culture and their family and everything else is just because they felt like it, right? It's usually they're being pushed out of there because of either famine or some other natural disaster like floods and stuff, or it's war. People generally don't make these huge migrations just because they woke up one day and felt like it. So all those parallels to me were very interesting. And the other thing is then the response, right? This becomes kind of predictable in human kind of societies, which is, like you said, the response to the waves of Italian immigrants back in the early 20th century was, at the time, what was seen as the most strict immigration laws in U.S. history, and probably to this day they are the strictest, which was in 1924, which banned people coming from that part of the world, right, Eastern Europe and these places, but also banned Chinese immigrants and people coming from places like that as well. So you see a lot of that kind of energy from the various angles here again 100 years later. So that's what to me was part of an interesting contrast as well.
Yeah. I mean, in the idea, like in the U.S. at the time, they talked about how, obviously in a city like New York, and then just in general, I mean, the crime is going to be around anytime there's people around. Anytime there's rules, there's going to be people that are skirting the rules and so forth. But it wasn't very organized, and so when you import this kind of, one other thing that really defined the kind of the Sicilian culture and the values was it was very clannish. And so you stick that in to this place like New York, then you can see kind of how you can have the green sprouts of something that is very family oriented and very inward looking in terms of how it operates, to create, ultimately to grow into something bigger. Because again, at that time, lots of crime, but it wasn't very organized. It would like, you'd have some gangs that would run a couple of streets, they're shaking that down, but that's about it. It wasn't some massive organization with tentacles and all of these different things and making millions and millions of dollars and so forth. And so, like we see through the documentary, the growth of the mafia and like how the growth and then what that necessitates. So when you look at, kind of that, like whether it be how prohibition ends up being, like this galvanizing force, because creating this large black market, it infuses so much money, so much available money into them, and also how that necessitated shortly after prohibition, you start having, the gangsters start organizing. You got the Lucky Luciano and creating. They're organizing as far as the five families to avoid war, because war messes with the money and so forth. So any parts about that, kind of really was something that jumped out to you?
Yes. So to me was, again, the fascinating part of this whole journey for the American Mafia, for several reasons. One is, like you said, I think a couple of things come together here. Some of it is the situations at hand, kind of where culture and technology, all that stuff was at the time. Some of it is the individual people, the players. And I think you're right. Lucky Luciano whether people like him or not, seems to be a very instrumental human being of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Just in so many ways that weren't even talked about in this documentary. I mean, one of the things, just on a quick tangent for the audience to look up, is the relationship between the U.S. military and the Italian mafia during World War II with the longshoremen. Luciano specifically there to make sure that the German spies weren't able to mess up the Navy yards and the building of the ships and all that. So, this was another example where here's a guy at the time who was younger, meaning Lucky, who, he was a gangster. I mean, they talked about how he assassinated the two mob bosses at the time and all that.
One of which was his boss.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I'm not trying to make him
took out the other one too.
Yeah, I'm not trying to make
because they were having that was part of. They were the two biggest bootleggers. Those other two bosses, and they were at war, which was creating all this heat, making it hard.
Well, that's why don't go too much. Let me go on my trajectory, because you bring in the bootlegging, which is, I just want to make it the point that I'm not saying this to paint Luciano as a sympathetic figure. He was a gangster for real. So I'm not saying he's a guy I want to go have dinner with and that kind of stuff that I want him watching my kids. But the idea is that you're right. That's where I was going to go. The idea of prohibition. That seems to have been, that was another good thing of the documentary that they've stuck on it. And that's another thing I thought of, the law of unintended consequences. This push to ban alcohol in the United States then led to, like you said, the bootlegging was so profitable that by the mid-20s and the late 20s, Luciano, like you say, gets rid of the current bosses, because he has this vision, which is, let me copy what's happened in the last 100 years, the industrial age, and what America seems to have perfected, which is capitalism. And he used a corporate structure. And you're right, he brought to the underworld a lot of parts of the overworld that worked. And the other reason, and then I hand it back, why I think he was a pretty unique and interesting person, is someone from the underworld who saw the benefit of not fighting, right? And said, hey, this war stuff, us killing each other, is actually bad for business. So if we actually can get together and collude and create kind of a cartel, and we just make sure our families are running things, and we kind of stop anyone who gets in our way, we'll be able to have more power, more control, and a smoother operation and make more money. And it worked. That's what I mean. It was pretty profound.
Yeah. I mean, as the documentary laid it out, you're talking 30 years of amongst mobsters of relative peace, in a way that allows them to maximize money and minimize the heat that they get from law enforcement, because when people are dead in the streets, then you get more attention from law enforcement. When they're not, then you get less and you're able to make money. And I think that, yes, you look at prohibition, and I think the documentary does a good job of showing how that's the galvanizing force. Like, when there's that much money at stake, then that enterprising mind will be like, hey, we can do bigger than just a couple of blocks. But in order to do bigger than a couple of blocks, we need to bring in a larger organization structure. But what also stood out to me, remember, prohibition didn't last that whole time, is that prohibition might have been the galvanizing force behind the organization, and like the going multi-state, interstate, and all that, making connections in Buffalo, Chicago, and then to Italian immigrants all over the United States. But once prohibition goes away, they seem to be very nimble also into what else they would get into. Like they would get into extortion, they would get into to start controlling labor unions, they would get into other types of things, and they quickly though, they would quickly jump here, and it really, to me, revealed kind of because the way they're able to operate with impunity in this sense, it really did reveal, like, we look at, United States, first world developed and everything like that. This was like a wild, wild west kind of thing. Like, they're showing up at people's doors like, all right, we need X amount of dollars every, week, or else, we're going to come break your windows. And that's just the way it works. This is on a large scale. Or, hey, we got a couple of guys that need to be on payroll, and they're never going to show up. And they're doing this, by the thousands, and keeping all this stuff organized and going. I don't even look at it to romanticize it. It's just it's staggering the scale when they're talking about people are making. One of the bosses of the five families, Bonanno, I believe, had a gambling operation that's bringing $4 million in a week, which is like $100 million a week today.
That's crazy. Yeah,
so the scale of what they're able to do beyond just prohibition was just jarring to me. And,
Yeah.
I did want to ask you though, like they had their code, and the documentary at several points puts out their code. You had to have Sicilian roots. You had to obey the boss, code of honor, which is like no drugs, different things like no messing with the other guy's wife. It's a lifetime membership. And then omerta, which is like the code of silence and so forth. And this is all the kind of values that are brought in when Luciano organizes it, and organizes it around 5 families that meet, and they have this commission and so forth. What do you think as far as how they were able to maintain that for so long? Because this goes until basically Joe Valachi, who is the former mobster who testifies in front of Congress in 1963. So, like Luciano, we're talking late 20s, early 30s. And so until then, the mob is almost like a myth because people hear about it and know about it or have some firsthand experience, but nobody talks about it. And so they're able to maintain this code for that long. Like, what do you think about that? Like, is that as unbelievable to you as it is to me?
Yes, but in one thing, I'm going to stop this serious conversation and say that gives me hope that I may find the headquarters for Antifa one day, because it's another example of something I keep hearing about, but I never see him. I never, there's no way to identify him. So maybe you got me. Maybe in 30 years we'll find out who's really running that thing. But in any case, since I don't know
hearing,
that,
right? But you got to make sure it's not a Russian spy that's doing the testifying at the congressional hearing.
Listen, man, I'm not even going to entertain who it is. I'm just saying that since I can't figure out that one and I can figure out this Mafia thing, we'll get back. All
right. So back to the documentary, my friend.
Yes. So So all of that I find fascinating. And here's the thing that I'll tie in, which is interesting, to throw back to another show we did. People want to go look at our library. The book Amusing Ourselves to Death, and the idea, the influence of the medium of television onto our culture. And that's really where I'm getting at, because I'm going to start, before I get to Valachi in 63, in 1950 was the first televised hearings of any discussion on the Mafia. And this whole thing. And what I found interesting, the documentary cites that 31 million Americans tuned in, but they didn't say it was what the population was. So I went to Google and I looked at what was the population of the United States in 1950, and it was 151,325,798 people. I mean, they were very exact. But the bottom line is, I was like, okay, so that's actually a lot of a percentage. That's 1 in 5. That's around 20% of the country. And
then a lot of those people are like kids. So in terms of adults, it's even a higher percentage.
Yeah, and yeah, good point. And but I just thought about what's the most recent thing like that. It would have been maybe the January 6th hearings, which I think had 20 million out of 330 million people watch. So meaning as something in terms of a collective, that's like the amount of Americans that almost watch the Super Bowl today, like 1/5 of the population. So it is a big number now. And that's why I say I was thinking about that book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, because it seems like once the television exposed the Mafia, like you're saying, that it was no longer an unknown thing, that it was like, wow, not only is it real, but I can put a face to it. And at the time, think about what we're talking about here, right? The way that Americans felt about Italian immigrants just a generation prior. Like I said, the 1924 law on immigration specifically targeted that part of the world. So then you got by 1950, the country, like you said, is beginning to see that these Italians are behaving a certain way. And it becomes, and they even said in the documentary, began that culture that we have today, which is the cities versus the rural areas. And some people in this country begin to say that, hey, the cities are where all the bad stuff is happening, and all these the immigrants and the poor people and all this kind of the way that, they're not the real Americans in those cities. So I found that interesting, that it's kind of like television allowed a certain way of people seeing into it, but then it also created these new myths around the country about who these people were. Who are these Italian Americans? What are they so prone to criminality? And all these things that followed the Italian American community around for then the next couple generations. So I found all that very interesting about that period.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the two are related a lot of times, because marginalized groups oftentimes are more prone, like people seek opportunity. And when groups are marginalized, a lot of times the opportunity isn't in the upper world. Like the upper world is turning its back on you. And so the opportunity might be the underworld, and so it's one of those things that, that there's lucrative opportunity there. And so the people around you are doing that. And so you can understand how there's a draw. People have observed that more recently in terms of why the mafia may not be as big anymore. It's like, well, Italian Americans are kind of integrated into normal society now. Like there's a lot of other
I like that part at the end too. Yeah, I like the way they said that.
But yeah, there's a lot of other things that people are doing, that it's like, that's not a primary or a super lucrative option for people now. So people aren't gravitating towards that anymore. I thought that the ability to maintain the code of silence and that it's mythical, so to speak, for people. Like even in the initial hearings, remember that people are up there pleading the fifth. I respectfully, I'm not going to say anything about that or anything like that. And so it still wasn't concrete. And so either people with a vested interest or the more skeptical people like, oh, well, they're still exaggerating the scale of this because the U.S. government and really seeing how large it was, it illustrates why local governments were so overmatched in trying to deal with something like this. And so it was when the feds really start directing their attention here that you start to see the start being more hiccups with the operation of the mob in that sense. And a lot of that dealt with how they got their fingers in and their tentacles in to organize labor. And then also just commerce in general. They're skimming off, the top of so many different industries that the U.S. government's like, hey, we got to try to come up with something to do with this. And the government is big enough to take a national organization like that on. And so that's when you see the tide starting to turn. But to the ability to make so much money in the 30s and the 40s being a ghost is just that's so mind-boggling to me. And I imagine that kind of stuff happens now. But now a lot of things happen without face-to-face contact. Like so much commerce happens without face-to-face contact. That's not how it was then. People weren't just zelling money around. Like you wanted to get the cash, you had to show up and put your hands on the cash. Like it wasn't like so. You got that much cash changing hands, and this organization is a myth that people in Middle America are like, oh yeah, that's not even real. So it's amazing to me, and that's that level of organization and how you get that many people to stick to some code until. With Joe Valachi, Joe Valachi is the guy who used to be a mobster who then turns the first one to then testify. And he's the one that gives up all the goods. He's the one that starts disclosing, okay, there's 5 families, their leaders meet. It's called the commission. This is how everything is organized. These are the leaders, yada, yada, yada. He puts all of that stuff in the public view. And then then it's really open season on these guys. And that really fundamentally changed how, and I know you want to get to this part, how not just many of the bosses dealt with the public. You start seeing bosses becoming more public at that time, but also how the public and how the feds are, how aggressively they're going after the mob, because he exposes how huge of an organization this is. So, I mean, I thought that part was fascinating, and then also piece with this just real quick was, at this point, also, you started having the second generation guys, the guys who weren't born in Sicily and immigrated, but who were born in America. Well, a lot of them had different values. A lot of them, we're okay with more publicity. We're okay with a different approach necessarily than the dads had and the granddads had and so forth. So you started seeing all that come together, in that mid 1960s, so forth, which changed the character of it completely, even where the code, those codes kind of becoming more and more marginalized.
Yeah, I think all of that makes this whole experience of the Cosa Nostra and the Italian American Mafia very unique. And also that it may not happen. Times, Yeah, and it may not happen again like that, at least, like that, like you're saying, because you had so many of these, like we talked about at the beginning, the culture of Sicily and all that. And it's a good point you make about like anything else. Like obviously once those guys are here and have kids, a generation or two later, you're not going to have the same type of men, right? They're not guys from Sicily, from this old school culture of this, like we talked about at the beginning. And so, and then with the medium of television, this to me is what's very interesting is, and I realize, because part of it, I mean, I'm going to say some things that aren't directly from the documentary, but just understanding, what do you call it? The kind of Italian mafia culture that we've grown up with, people our age, at least, the movies like Casino, Goodfellas, and like when Robert De Niro's character in Casino had his TV show, and then the old bosses hated it, right? They were like, nah, man, they bring in too much heat, and that's what I mean, like this tension, like you're saying, this Joe Colombo was on the Dick Cavett show in 1971. And they showed that in the documentary, and it's like the old bosses hated that because you still had some old bosses from the Sicily days, but it's again, that's what I mean by the book Amusing Ourselves to Death, this culture of television and entertainment and the media in America is so also unique. You know, there's like the Hollywoodization of everything. And so it's like this thing that just traps everybody that gets close to it, like a moth to a flame. And the Mafia was no different. Once those guys started engaging the public through like being celebrities, you know, you could draw a line between Joe Colombo in 1971 and John Gotti, you know, when we were kids in the 90s in New York. And so, but what did that do, to your point? That gave a target. It's like Frank Lucas sitting in the front row of the Muhammad Ali fight with a big mink coat.
Yeah.
Right. That's apparently when the feds show up and, oh, who's this guy?
Yeah.
And so once you make yourself public, then the feds also are watching you. And so it's this weird tension. But eventually, by being public, they were brought down. So, you know.
Well, it's not just being public, but it definitely increases the target on your back. But I wonder if that, you know, again, was the sign of the times. And just briefly, before we get too far away from it, one of the things that really surprised me about this is like, yes, those 80s, 90s, I guess you can go all the way back to The Godfather, but, you know, the 80s, 90s mob movies that were, you know, they were very popular at that time. They drew heavily off of this stuff.
Yeah, I know.
I'm watching this like, oh man, I remember that storyline from this movie. Oh, I remember that storyline from this. Like, so it was interesting to me to see like many of the kind of storylines that we saw.
They were like true, yeah.
Yeah, I was like, oh, okay, well, that's where they got that from, you know. And so it was familiar. And I'm watching now, but this is a real thing. This is the documentary with real images of the real guys and so forth. So, you know, but back to where I was going to go with that, though, just the sign of the times piece. You know, like, and this is where you bring up the television and how that affects things, because it seemed like many of the guys, not all of them, some of them still thrived in the shadows and survived in the shadows. But many of them were drawn to the appeal of the idea of the celebrity. You know, like even the first couple of, you know, like from those hearings a couple times, there would be like guys that they looked cool, you know, they got the glasses on, you know, and, you know, Crazy Joe Gallo, and he's got the sunglasses on, he's chain smoking on TV. And then the culture is like, oh, this guy's amazing. This guy's so cool. Yeah. And so other mob bosses are like, some of them are like, yo, I'm cooler than him. Yeah. I need to get out there and show people how cool I am. So it's like you have this divergence of what people think it means to be like. Initially, it seemed like there was one way to be a mob boss, so to speak, or one kind of way, you know, like there's this is what you do, this is how you behave, and so forth. But the idea of what it meant to be a mob boss expanded over time, and so other people took different routes that kind of fit with their personalities. And so the question really is that like because of the nature of what they're trying to do, which is inherently there's criminality involved. Is that like, you know, kind of just, is that signals it kind of like this is going to have to go in a different direction now? Because you can't be a celebrity in the same sense if your business involves keeping quiet the stuff that, you know, like the real stuff that you're doing. You make the more notoriety you give yourself, the easier it is for people who don't want you to do what you do to try to connect you to different things. And then the other thing I'll mention just briefly is the change in law. You know, the bringing up of the RICO laws that allow, you know, once you show that one person is doing a crime, if you can show that they're connected to somebody else, then both of them can go down for that crime. You know, like that's when it seemed like the feds got for real. Like, yep, this is going to end. And so you look in the 80s and, you know, they're able to bring down bosses and lots of people, you know, just being able to find criminality in one area. So that was the other thing I'll mention. Any last thoughts you want to get to before we get out of here?
Yeah, because I remember there was a part of when it talked about the 80s and 90s about how every construction job in New York City, basically all the different layers that went through the mafia.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you didn't make me appreciate an individual until you just went on your rant, and it made me think of one person who beat that system. And I'm going to say this, and it's going to make you laugh, but I'm being dead serious, which is, we have a president that used to do business in New York City and was shown to be involved with a lot of guys like this. And he figured it out, which is, I'm just going to run for office and I'm going to win. And when I get in there, I'm going to just change things. The Supreme Court going to give me immunity. And that way I can be public and do my stuff and do, you know. So
I don't know if I saw that part in the documentary.
Yeah. So no, that wasn't in the documentary. You just made me appreciate that's how you beat it. Because you're right, James, as you're talking about it, I'm thinking like, you're right. And that's why I bring up, and just to finish off here, the serious thing I said about the television and the medium of entertainment, because in a sense, you're right, that began to hollow out the quality of leadership in the Italian American mafia.
The priorities of the leadership.
That's what I'm getting at.
You know?
The quality, what I mean is that those who focused on business versus those who found it an attractive way, like a narcissism way, like, oh, well, I can, like you said about Joe Gallo, I can sit and look cool with sunglasses and smoke a cigarette in front of the congressional hearing and tell all these guys to go F themselves, but also the girls will think I'm cool and the guys on the block will think I'm cool and all this. So what happens is, and that's what I mean, James, it's kind of, the television has done that to our entire society. You can look at businesses, you can look at politicians, right? We used to have a time when politics was occupied by boring people that wanted to go and do wonky stuff, like figure out how to make trains run on time. And since the last 20 years, because of social media, it's now made up of people who want to go in there and be seen, right? And just want to talk, right? And say things to get clicks and likes. So
a lot of self-aggrandizing. That's a good parallel.
That's what I mean. So it's interesting that the mafia may have gotten kind of killed by something that may end up killing the whole country, right? Like our whole culture, which is this, like you say, self-aggrandizement and the type of people that are ascending to all aspects of leadership.
But it happens incrementally though, because remember, like with Crazy Joe Gallo, he didn't go like that wasn't his objective. That was just his
he was just a dick.
And then, but other people saw the reaction he got. And they were like, "Oh, okay." And so he expanded he unwittingly expanded what people thought was possible. And so, and you can draw that parallel elsewhere. You know, in terms of people expand what's possible here. In order to be a leader, do you have to be a public servant? Do you have to put the country first? And it's like, well, people have shown that no, actually you can be an entertainer. And, you know, like, and you can be an entertainer first. And that works at least as far as to get you where you want to go, you know? And so it expands what people think is possible. And it changes the character and the values of the people that are filling these roles. And so ultimately, when you got too many of the bosses of the five families more worried about publicity and celebrity than the ability to do business and keep it all secret, you know, is severely hampered. And so, and then again, combine that with the changes in laws, the changes in technology and so forth. And, you know, you get to see this whole arc, you know, and tying the culture that arrived with the time, you know, like the kind of modern times that it was in, I thought was really a part of the story. You know, like you have that same kind of, those people show up in 1820. I don't think it unfolds the way that it does. Or if they show up in 2020, it doesn't unfold the way. Now, it may still become something, but it really seemed like the Italian mafia in America becoming so big, it really seemed like a marriage between a particular time period and a particular group of people that, you know, that happened simultaneously. So yeah, man, it was a good though. I mean, I definitely would recommend people check it out, especially if you were interested in any, you know, if you liked Casino, like you said, or if you liked Goodfellas back in the day, then check this out because it was really interesting in terms of you'll see some of those parallel storylines, you know, that were were fictionalized, so to speak. But you could say, okay, yeah, clearly this was based on people who had read a lot of these stories about the real people. So, but we appreciate everybody for joining us on this episode of Call Like I See It. Subscribe to the podcast, rate it, review it, tell us what you think, send it to a friend. Until next time, I'm James Keys.
I'm Tunde Ogunlana.
All right, we'll talk soon.